6 torpedoes, 72,000 tons of steel, and a submarine captain who had already failed once and swore he never would again. November 29, 1944. 140 miles south of Tokyo Bay. It is 17 minutes past 3 in the morning, and the ocean is black in every direction. Commander Joseph Enright presses his eye to the periscope and forgets, for a moment, to breathe. What fills the lens is not a warship. It is a shape that should not exist, a flight deck longer than 3 football fields laid end to end, a hull so wide it swallows the horizon whole. 3 destroyers circle it like pilot fish orbiting something too large to be real. And Enright understands, with a certainty that has nothing to do with the cold night air, that he is looking at the largest aircraft carrier ever built, a ship the entire United States Navy does not know exists. He has 6 torpedoes loaded in his forward tubes. 6 against 70,000 tons of armor, steel, and engineering built to survive anything the Pacific could throw at it. The giant is moving at 20 knots, cutting zigzags through the darkness, and Enright will get exactly 1 shot, measured not in minutes but in seconds. To understand how an impossible warship ended up in these waters at 3 in the morning, and why 6 torpedoes were about to erase it from history, we have to go back 2.5 years, to the day Japan's carrier fleet burned at Midway. June 4, 1942. In a single afternoon, 4 Japanese fleet carriers are sent to the bottom of the Pacific. 322 aircraft are destroyed. Thousands of sailors and airmen are killed before the sun goes down. Before Midway, Japan commands 10 aircraft carriers. After Midway, 6 remain, and Japan is losing carriers faster than its shipyards can replace them. America launches a new carrier roughly every 2 months. Japan needs a full year to build just one. At the Yokosuka Naval Yard, a massive hull sits half-finished on the building ways. This was meant to be a battleship, the 3rd of the Yamato-class, sister to the 2 largest warships ever constructed. Its keel had been laid 2 years earlier. By the summer of 1942, tens of thousands of tons of armor plate, turbine housings, and gun foundations had already been welded into place. Then the order arrives from Tokyo: stop building the battleship. Turn the hull into a carrier. Japan no longer needs gun turrets. It needs flight decks. What emerges from that decision is something the world has never seen: a carrier built on the bones of a battleship, its flight deck engineered to shrug off shells and 1,000-kilogram bombs that would tear any ordinary ship apart. The man who would be given command of this monster had spent the last 2 years living with a ghost of his own. Commander Joseph Enright, a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, had already lived through the worst moment a submarine commander can face. On his first combat patrol in late 1942, he had a Japanese carrier lined up in his periscope. He tracked it for hours. He calculated the firing solution. And in the final seconds, the carrier turned, and Enright hesitated. 3 heartbeats of doubt. The target vanished into the dark, and in his patrol report, he wrote 4 words that would haunt him: contact lost, target escaped. He then did something almost no officer does: he asked to be relieved of command. Stop and sit with that for a second. You have an enemy carrier in your crosshairs. You hesitate for 3 heartbeats. It slips away into the night. Do you ask to be pulled from command, like Enright did, or do you stay and try to burn away that failure on the next patrol? Tell me in the comments which kind of officer you think you'd be, because there are 2 kinds who watch videos like this one: the ones who walk away, and the ones who stay to fight their own ghosts. The Navy didn't give Enright a desk. It gave him the USS Archerfish, an aging submarine whose crew had spent 3 years at war without a single confirmed warship kill to their name. Patrol after patrol, and nothing to show for it. On the other side of the ocean was Captain Toshio Abe, commander of this new Leviathan. Abe was a destroyer man through and through, fast, aggressive, instinctive. He'd made his name at Guadalcanal closing distance while other captains pulled back. but he had never commanded a carrier in his life. And the ship beneath his feet was a problem that no amount of courage could solve. This carrier stretched over 870 feet, with a beam of nearly 120. Fully loaded, it displaced 72,000 tons, heavier than any carrier in history. Its armored flight deck was the thickest ever mounted on a ship of its kind, and its torpedo defense system, layered compartments built to absorb and disperse the shock of an underwater blast, followed the same specifications as its battleship sisters. On paper, this ship could take 6 torpedo hits and keep fighting. But this ship was not finished. And that single fact would decide everything. It had entered service on November 19, 1944, exactly 10 days before its first and only voyage. Its crew of over 2,500 men had been aboard less than 2 weeks. Most had never served on a carrier before in their lives. Damage control teams had never run a single flooding drill, not one. More than 800 watertight doors had never been tested under real pressure. Many of their seals didn't sit flush. The emergency pumping systems meant to save the ship in a crisis had never been run at full capacity. And the lower compartments that were supposed to be packed with concrete ballast for stability sat completely empty, open voids filled with nothing but air. Captain Abe knew every one of these failures. He had personally filed a formal objection against sailing. The original schedule called for the fitting out to finish in December, with full sea trials in January of 1945. But American B-29 bombers had started striking Tokyo, and the Naval High Command feared their prize ship would be caught helpless at anchor in an air raid, unable to maneuver, unable to defend itself. The order came down without room for argument: move the ship that night to the naval base at Kure, 400 miles to the southwest. November 28, 1944. Abe requested a full escort of 8 destroyers to protect the crossing. He was given three destroyers, guarding the largest carrier in the history of naval warfare, through waters where American submarines had already sent more than 200 Japanese warships to the bottom that year alone. And 12 miles away, one of those submarines was sitting on the surface, bored, restless, and listening. The USS Archerfish had been assigned to the most unglamorous job in the fleet, waiting off the coast of Honshu to rescue any downed B-29 bomber crews. At 8:48 that evening, radar operator John Hustler picked up a contact to the northwest. Range, 24,000 yards. Moving fast. Enright raised the periscope. What he saw made no sense. An island, moving at 20 knots. As the image sharpened, the scale of it hit him. This wasn't a warship, wasn't even a heavy cruiser. The flight deck ran past the edges of what his periscope could even frame. The hull sat low and heavy in the water, as if the ocean itself was straining to hold the weight above the surface. He radioed a contact report to command: large carrier, likely newly built, moving to attack position. What followed was a 4-hour chase that pushed the Archerfish past its limits. The submarine ran on the surface at 19 knots, its absolute top speed. The carrier held 20, zigzagging along a base course, and every time it turned toward the Archerfish the gap closed, and every time it turned away, Enright fell behind, losing a race decided by a single knot of speed. For 3 straight hours, the diesel engine screamed at full power. The hull shook so violently the crew had to grip the overhead piping just to stay on their feet. The chief engineer reported the engines pushed past their rated limits, briefly hitting 21 knots in bursts that risked cracking the cylinder heads outright. The temperature in the engine room climbed past 140 degrees. At 11:45 that night, the carrier turned, not zigzagging away, but straight toward the Archerfish. Abe's sonar team had picked up a contact ahead, and Abe reacted exactly as a destroyer captain would: turn toward the threat, close the distance, meet it head-on. It was the right instinct for a 2,000-ton destroyer. For the commander of a 72,000-ton carrier, it was a fatal one. A carrier captain turns away and lets his escorts handle the threat. Abe attacked. Enright watched the course change through his periscope and could barely process what was happening. The largest ship he had ever seen in his life was turning directly into his firing line. He ordered the Archerfish down to periscope depth. What happened in the next 60 seconds would become the single most consequential submarine attack of the entire Pacific War, and the 4 explosions that followed, 7 hours later, would send the largest carrier ever built to the bottom of the ocean. At 3:17 in the morning, the Archerfish sat at periscope depth, 100 yards off the carrier's starboard side. Through the scope, the hull filled the entire field of view. There was nothing else to see. Over 20 seconds, Enright fired all 6 torpedoes in a spread. Then, silence. 10 seconds. 20. 30. 80 men gripped valves and pipes in a steel tube beneath the Pacific, holding their breath together. 3 sharp, metallic explosions in quick succession. Then a 4th, deeper, heavier, rolling through the water like something breaking apart from the inside. 4 of the 6 torpedoes had struck a 200-foot stretch of the carrier's starboard hull. In seconds, everything changed. On the bridge, Captain Abe was thrown against the compass housing. The lights failed. Emergency generators kicked in, flooding the corridors in red. Water poured into the ship at a rate no one had accounted for because no one had ever tested how the flooding compartments would actually hold. The torpedo hits had torn open a gash below the waterline longer than a city block, and seawater rushed straight into the empty voids, the same compartments that should have been packed solid with concrete ballast. Instead, they acted like funnels, channeling water past the barriers that were supposed to contain it, deeper and deeper into the ship. The watertight doors failed one after another. Seals leaked. Latches jammed. Some doors had simply been left open by the 300 civilian shipyard workers still aboard, still trying to finish compartments that should have been completed weeks earlier. By 4 a.m., the ship had rolled 7 degrees to starboard. Abe ordered the counter-flooding tanks open to level the ship. The crew turned the valves. Nothing happened, they were jammed shut. Abe ordered bucket brigades and portable pumps instead. 2,000 men ran through dark, tilting corridors, hauling seawater from one side of the dying ship to the other by hand. By 5 a.m., the list had reached 12 degrees. The armored flight deck, engineered to absorb direct bomb hits, was now tilting like a ramp. Aircraft in the hangar broke loose from their tie-downs, slammed into bulkheads, and ruptured fuel lines. Aviation fuel mixed with seawater in the lower decks. The still unfinished ventilation system spread the fuel vapor through compartment after compartment, straight toward damaged electrical circuits throwing sparks. By 6 a.m., the list hit 20 degrees. Abe gave the order to abandon ship. But the internal communication system, installed only 9 days earlier, had failed with the very first torpedo strike. Messengers sprinted through flooded corridors, screaming the order to men who couldn't hear them over the roar of incoming water. The 3 escort destroyers pulled alongside as the massive hull rolled beneath them. Sailors slid down the hull into the sea, some were crushed between the carrier and the destroyers as the ship convulsed. At 10:57 on the morning of November 29, 1944, 7 hours and 40 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the ship rolled hard to starboard, lifted its bow toward the sky, and slipped stern first into the Pacific. Its wreck settled 4,000 meters down. Captain Toshio Abe refused a life vest. He refused to leave the bridge. He went down with his ship, and with 1,435 of his men. The destroyers pulled just over 1,000 survivors from the water, many of them civilian construction workers who had no life jackets and no evacuation training at all. Sailors handed over their own vests to keep them alive. 2 hours after the attack, Enright brought the Archerfish back to the surface. His sonar operators reported hearing the deep, groaning sounds of a massive hull tearing itself apart as it sank. In his patrol report, he estimated he had sunk a carrier of roughly 28,000 tons. Command reviewed the claim and credited him accordingly. The real number was 72,000 tons. It remains, 80 years later, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a record that still stands. The US Navy wouldn't learn the full truth until after Japan's surrender, when captured documents at Yokosuka finally revealed the specifications of the ship the Navy had never even known existed. Japan had hidden it so completely that American intelligence had no idea it was real until Enright saw it through his periscope. And Japan's reaction to the loss was just as extraordinary. The Imperial Navy buried the story so deeply that most of Japan's own senior commanders never learned the ship had been sunk at all. No formal inquiry. No interrogation. No report ever left the Naval General Staff. The largest aircraft carrier in history was built, commissioned, and destroyed almost entirely in secret. For Enright, those four torpedo strikes erased the ghost that had haunted him since 1942. The carrier that got away, the doubt that had eaten at his confidence for 2 years, it was answered by the one that didn't. He was awarded the Navy Cross and retired a Rear Admiral. But he never forgot the night he chased down a ship that shouldn't have existed, and sank it with torpedoes he very nearly didn't fire in time. The loss of that ship taught a lesson every modern Navy still lives by. Armor means nothing without preparation. The thickest plating, the most advanced torpedo defense, the most powerful engines in the world, none of it matters if the crew has never been trained, if the systems have never been tested, if the ship has never proven itself at sea. On paper, it's invincible. In practice, it's paper. A warship's true strength was never measured in steel. It's measured in time. That crew never got the time it needed, and no feat of engineering on Earth could make up the difference. Today, the US Navy puts every new carrier through months of acceptance trials before it ever sees combat. Modern navies run deliberate flooding drills before a single warship enters service, until the crew can handle an emergency by muscle memory alone, without thinking. None of that is coincidence. It's the legacy of one ship that sank in 7 hours. Because in the end, Enright didn't sink that carrier alone. The admirals who set an impossible deadline sank it. The shipyard workers who left the ballast compartments empty sank it. The inspectors who never pressure tested a single watertight door sank it. Archerfish just pulled the trigger. That ship's fate was sealed before it ever left port. 3 years to build. 10 days in service. 7 hours to sink. And 80 years later, it's still teaching the same lesson: a warship isn't its armor. A warship is its crew. If this story pulled you in, hit like and drop a comment. What do you think happens if Abe gets 2 more weeks to prepare his crew? Does that ship survive for torpedoes, or does the ocean win either way? Subscribe, because the next story we're bringing you is even harder to believe.